It's been nearly 3 decades since the unsolved murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey, a case that captivated the nation. And even though her parents...
On the morning after Christmas in 1996, a 6-year-old girl named JonBenét Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado. She had been a familiar face on the child beauty pageant circuit, bright, animated, always smiling for the camera. By the next morning, that image had been replaced by something the country could not look away from. A murder investigation that would run for nearly 3 decades without an arrest. This is not a story about someone finally breaking a decades-long silence. Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's older brother, spoke publicly about his sister's death only once. In a 3-part interview with Dr. Phil McGraw that aired in September 2016, 20 years after the murder. He was 29 years old at the time. He has not given another interview since. When Netflix approached him in 2024 for a new documentary revisiting the case, he turned the request down, saying he'd had enough of being picked apart by the media and amateur internet detectives. That single decision to speak once and never again says almost as much about what this case did to a family as anything he told Dr. Phil that year. To understand why one interview could feel so consequential, you have to go back to the beginning. John and Patsy Ramsey woke up the day after Christmas to find their daughter missing from her bed. Instead of an empty room, they found something far stranger. A handwritten ransom note, nearly 3 pages long, demanding a very specific sum of money and warning them not to call the police. Patsy called anyway. Within the hour, the house was filling with officers, friends, and clergy, a crowd that, in hindsight, investigators now agree should never have been allowed to move freely through what was, in fact, an active crime scene. For most of that day, no one searched the house systematically. It was hours later, after officers had been in and out, after evidence had likely been disturbed, that a detective suggested John Ramsey take a look around the basement himself. He did, and he found his daughter's body in a small storage room. He carried her upstairs. It was an act of instinct and grief, not procedure, but it was also one more disruption to a crime scene that had already been compromised by the chaos of the morning. Investigators, journalists, and forensic experts who have studied the case for years generally agree on one thing. The earliest hours after JonBenét's death were mishandled badly enough to make everything that followed harder to solve. Evidence went uncollected. The scene wasn't secured. And because there were no visible signs of forced entry into the home, suspicion turned almost immediately toward the people who lived there. For more than a decade, John and Patsy Ramsey lived as unofficial suspects in their own daughter's murder, even though they were never charged. The ransom note itself became a point of obsession. Its length, its oddly specific dollar figure that happened to match a bonus John had recently received at work, and the fact that it was written on a notepad taken from inside the house. To investigators focused on an inside job theory, those details all pointed one direction. The media coverage moved fast, and it moved cruelly. For days after JonBenét's death, a photograph of her in pageant makeup ran in the news, and from that point on, the story stopped being only about a murdered child. It became a story about a family that critics assumed must have been hiding. Something overly ambitious parents, a strange household, a picture-perfect image concealing something dark. John Ramsey has said publicly many times over the years that none of that matched the daughter he knew. A kid with a big personality who genuinely enjoyed pageants, not a child being pushed into them. Burke, only 9 years old at the time, was pulled into that same current of suspicion. He had been in the house the night his sister disappeared. He didn't wake up during the commotion. To a public hungry for answers, that alone was enough to make him a subject of theories. Some of them aired years later on national television. In 2016, CBS aired a documentary special that laid out a theory suggesting Burke, as a child, may have struck his sister and that his parents covered it up. Burke sued the network. The case was eventually settled in 2019 for an undisclosed amount. It was against that backdrop a public theory of guilt broadcast to millions, followed by years of being recognized as that kid from the JonBenét case, that Burke agreed to sit down with Dr. Phil later that same year. In the interview, Burke described the fragments he remembered from that night and the days after. his mother searching his room, calling out for JonBenét, being told by his father that his sister had gone to heaven, and crying because his father was crying, more than because he understood what death meant. He talked about visiting her casket and noticing something that struck him as wrong about the way she looked. He said plainly that he did not hurt his sister. When Dr. Phil pressed him on the theories that had circulated for years, Burke didn't deflect. He said he understood why people suspected him, even while insisting it wasn't true. He also said something that had nothing to do with proving his innocence, and everything to do with the 20 years he'd spent grieving privately. That he still talks to JonBenét, the way you might talk to someone you miss badly enough that silence doesn't feel like an option. It was the kind of detail that didn't fit the suspect narrative that had followed him since childhood. A grown man, still finding small ways to keep a conversation with his 6-year-old sister going. Analysts who reviewed his body language after the interview aired noted something else. Moments where Burke appeared to smile at strange points in the conversation. Some viewers read that as suspicious. People who study trauma responses offered a different read, that an inappropriate-looking smile can be a nervous, involuntary reaction to discomfort, not evidence of anything deeper. Both interpretations circulated widely. Neither was ever backed by anything resembling proof. In 2008, more than a decade after the murder, the Boulder District Attorney's Office announced that DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing, belonging to an unidentified male, did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. The DA's office went further than most exonerations typically do, issuing a formal statement acknowledging that the family should not have been treated as suspects for as long as they were. For John Ramsey, it was vindication that came too late to matter the way it should have. Patsy Ramsey had died 2 years earlier, in 2006, after a long battle with ovarian cancer, the same disease that had first threatened her life not long after JonBenét's murder. She died without ever officially being cleared, without ever knowing whether the person responsible for her daughter's death would be found. John has said in the years since that the weight of that, losing his wife to grief and illness at once, without answers, has never fully lifted. Being cleared didn't end the story either. Burke, DNA excluded as far back as 1999, still carried the label the public had given him years earlier. Being formally ruled out by science doesn't erase a reputation that television specials and internet forums spent 2 decades building. John Ramsey has spent the years since 2008 pushing, publicly and persistently, for the case to be reopened with modern forensic tools. His argument is straightforward. The technology used to solve cold cases today is nothing like what existed in 1996 or even in 2008. Genetic genealogy, the method that helped identify the Golden State Killer in 2018 after more than 4 decades on the run, didn't exist when JonBenét was killed. It works by comparing crime scene DNA against public genealogy databases to build out family trees, sometimes identifying a suspect who was never in a criminal database at all. John has pointed to that case specifically as proof of what might still be possible here. He has asked the Boulder Police Department to allow independent, outside labs to retest the DNA evidence still sitting in their custody, arguing that the same investigators who spent years suspecting his family have little incentive to revisit their own missteps. He has taken his request as far as petitioning Colorado's governor to intervene. As of now, the Boulder Police Department maintains that the case remains open and technically active, but John has said publicly that he has not been granted the access to evidence that he's asked for. He is not alone in continuing to work the case from the outside. Lou Smith, a retired homicide detective who joined the investigation in its early years, broke from his colleagues almost immediately. He believed the evidence pointed to an intruder, not the family, and said so loudly enough that it cost him his place on the team. He left the official investigation, but kept working the case privately until his death in 2010, compiling tips and a list of possible suspects that he ultimately passed on to his daughter, Cindy, who has continued that private effort in the years since. Burke Ramsey is in his late 30s today, living quietly and working as a software engineer, largely out of the public eye by choice. Aside from the 2016 Dr. Phil interview, he has not spoken publicly about his sister's death. When Netflix built its 2024 docuseries around the case, it did so with cooperation from John Ramsey and Burke's half-brother, John Andrew Ramsey, but not from Burke, who chose not to participate. The filmmakers said they respected that decision and didn't pressure him to change his mind. It's worth sitting with what that choice represents. A man who was 9 years old when the worst thing imaginable happened to his family, who grew up inside a national obsession he never asked to be part of, who was formally cleared by DNA evidence decades ago, and who still, all these years later, decides that silence is safer than another round of public scrutiny. That's not obstruction. It's closer to self-preservation. JonBenét Ramsey would be in her mid-30s now, had she lived. Instead, her name has become shorthand for one of the most examined unsolved cases in American history. Not because there's a shortage of theories, but because there's still no answer that fits every piece of evidence cleanly. What's actually true and documented is this. A 6-year-old girl was murdered in her home. The initial investigation was badly compromised in its first hours. A ransom note was left that still puzzles investigators today. DNA evidence from an unknown male was found on her body and clothing, and that DNA has never been matched to anyone. Her mother died without answers. Her father has spent almost 3 decades pushing for the case to be reopened with better tools than existed at the time. And her brother, cleared by science but never fully cleared by public opinion, gave his account once, quietly closed that chapter, and has chosen not to reopen it since. The case remains open. Boulder police say they continue to review it as new forensic techniques become available. Whether that ever produces a name is something no one, not John Ramsey, not the investigators, not the amateur sleuths who've spent years picking through the evidence online, can promise. What's certain is that the people closest to John